Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be looking at this very important Rook Endgame. Now, this Rook Endgame has happened in many games. It has a very typical defensive motive. I've defended this exact position successfully once as black. So, let's see. First of all, black has many moves that draw in this position. King g6 is probably the most simple. It follows at least my philosophy to draw this position. I'll explain to you what it is. Basically, this position is a draw because there are three squares in between the king and the rook, or the pawn and the rook, rather. That's a better way to put it. So the rook has a lot of checking distance. So when the king supports the pawn, it always will be a check that will annoy the king. Now, and when the king goes back to the rook to stop the checks, then the rook can play on the pawn, and the king won't have enough time to get back to the pawn to defend it. So this is why this position is a draw. I've explained this theory in a different video of mine. So king g6, I think, definitely draws easily because I like it how the rook is left on the back rank, because the king does not have really any tricks of going to the 8th rank, and the king cannot really support the pawn in that way. I should say this, all rook moves on the a file draw, like rook a1 draws, for example, because if like rook b7, we just bring the rook back, white has made no progress, or if king e8, king f6, e7, king e6. Now remember this position. For example, rook d2, rook a8, see, so now black will win the pawn. But remember this position, because when I said all the rook moves draw on the a file, the only one that doesn't draw is this move rook a6, because when we get this position, white has to move king f8. Now with the rook on a1, there would be a check on the f file. But with the king blocking the rook's check, then this pawn's promoting. Black needs to take the rook on d7, and white will easily win with queen versus rook. Not to mention that's a very easy queen-rook position to win because the king and rook are very poorly placed. So let's say king g6, rook b7. We're waiting. King g7. Again, a move like rook a1 draws. I don't really see a way how white makes progress. But okay, king g7. I just like to keep the rook on the back rank. It's very simple. I mean, it's a one part of chess to make the moves that will make your play the easiest. Rook c7. And now rook a1, still a draw, but king g6. But now we see the idea that white has. Now he's going to try to use the rook on the c file to block checks from the rook with the king on the d file. However, let's say we give a check. White has made no progress. In the case of e7, only king f7, and white cannot win this position. So let's say white tries again with king d6. I mean, I'm just having a few sample variations. I'm showing all the chances that white has to trick black, but really this position is just a draw. On the move rook a1, for example, this is still a draw. On the move king d7, you have to make the move rook a8 though, so that you can meet the move e7 with the move king f7, and e8 promotion doesn't work. You gotta keep that in mind. But I think rook a6 check is easier, rook c6, rook a8. And now on the move king d7, just make the move king f6. The rook needs to stay on the back rank because it has to anticipate e7 with king e7, with king f7. So that's why king f6 on the move e7 now. King f7 is just a draw. So rook c7, king g7, we still wait. On the move king to e7, king to g6, rook d7, and we get to this position. Now, king g7 is the best move, I think. But we get a position, I guess, from a game between Aronian and Carlsen, with Carlsen playing black. And Carlsen was very young when he was playing this game. I mean, he was an up-and-coming star, but he wasn't Carlsen yet. but you know, he was soon going to become Carlsen, but he was still immature, and he made this mistake of Rook B8. Notice that how in all of the sample variations that I gave, the Rook always stayed on the A file, and the reason why is because I told you the theory about the checking distance, how there have to be 3 squares in between the Rook and the pawn for there to be a successful checking distance. Now we see the example of the slightly smaller checking distance. Now, black is totally losing, and I would recommend you to pause the video and come up with the way how white should win this position. So white has no immediate win, but the thing is that white just it needs to keep the rook on the b file with this move rook a7. Now the rook will never go to the a file, and there will never be enough checking distance for the king. So black's if black wanted to play the move rook a8, if he would realize it's a mistake, start giving checks, then it won't work because the rook's already on a7. The white rook now takes control of that. So this position is very bad because now basically the rook cannot really leave the 8th rank. The move rook c8 gets hit with the move king d7. So black must wait with the move king g7. And now I would, if you haven't figured it out already, I would again recommend you to pause the video to come up with the way white wins. So firstly, I'll show this variation. Rook a1. The idea is to give a check on g1. Black gives a check, 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 and rook comes back. And now the question that I have is, how does white make progress? Because white doesn't really have a win on the move king d7. Then, you know, we give a check on b7, white make no progress, e7, king f7. It's a draw. That is why white has to get the exact same position, but with the move king on g6 rather than on g7. We'll see why. Because let's say, so now let's triangulate: king d6, king f6, king d7. Now this is Tookswang. Black, if the black rook moves, of course, e7 will win the game. King g7, king e7. Now this is Tookswang because now the move rook c8, you know, king d7. I'm sorry. The move rook c8 will probably get hit with a move like rook to a1, and yeah, that position is now losing because there's no checking distance at all. That's why king g6 is basically the only move here. It's forced. And now white makes the move rook a1. So let's assume that black goes for the exact same variation with rook d6, king d7. Here. Now rook e1 is winning because now if the king were on g7, there would be the move king f8 in this position. That's why the other line didn't work. With the king on g6, the king cannot stop the pawn. e7, e8 is our next move. So let's assume that if black starts giving checks rook c2, white will play king d7 on the move rook d2, king e8, and then, you know, it's quite straightforward. e7 and, you know, king f8 and, you know, the pawn will queen. You know, the rook can be used for the rook on can be used to cut off the king on the f file sometimes. So that's why rook b8. But now let's make the move king back to d7. Rook b7, king c8, and this position is losing. Rook e7. If we play the move king d8, king f6, we give the check on f1, king e6, and we give the check on e1, and then we simply take the rook on e7. So that would be very, this position is still losing. Black can try another form of defense with this move king f6 here. The point being that on the move rook f1, king g7, e7, rook b8. Now it's, the point is that the rook is kind of tied down to cutting off the king on the f file. So if the rook were to move, then king f7 would happen. And then a lot of the variations. So that's why this is a little bit tricky, but white just needs to recognize one thing. First of all, at the very least, white can win the game with the move king c7, rook e8, and rook a1. now the rook is basically forced off the back rank. I mean, you know, the rook a7 was the threat, but after the move rook a1, there's no rook a7, and you know, the next move is basically king d7 and promotion. So, you know, black will have to take the rook and then e8 queen, and white will need some technique to win this, but it should be pretty easy. However, I would recommend the move rook f4 in this position because we get a better version of the queen versus rook endgame. Because on rook a8, rook a4. I mean, there's no other move that black can play, so he must move the rook. At least, you know, threaten to give some checks from a6, but rook a4. The point being that now, let's just put this line. If he takes, then we queen. And let's say he gives a check, we can do this and check and king c5, and this is nice because now the queen, you know, defends the square over here on a4. So the king is just, and the king and queen are just better placed compared to the other rook endgame, when the rook would have more check distance to displace the white king further away. But you know, now I'm discussing very, you know, minor details. Of course, king queen versus king and rook is very easily winning. However, my point is, when defending this position, just never make this move rook b8. Always keep the rook on the file as 3 squares away from the pawn. I would recommend keeping the rook on the back rank, although you know, so you have to sometimes move it away. Let's go back. For example, in this position, on the move king d6, basically, you know, rook a6 kind of has to be played here, but it's okay. On the next move, you can put the rook back on a8, and you know, always keep this construction. You remember, you always have the waiting moves king g7, king g6, and you will defend this position very successfully. I think I showed all the tricks that white can try to win this game, but if black knows what he's doing, of course, you know, black won't lose this. And again, I have once defended this position successfully, and once when I was also, that one time that I did defend this, I was under extreme time pressure. So if you have any other endgames they would like me to show, please leave in the comments. All right, thanks.